Welcome. Good morning after the keynote session to Spring 1. We're here to talk about Spring Tools and the new Spring Tools 4. If you have been to the keynote, you might have already seen them or seen tiny little bits and pieces of them, and we will talk and give you a lot of more demos about what's coming up with Spring and Spring Tools. Before we start, we introduce ourselves quickly. My name is Martin Lippert. I work for Pivotal. And I work for the Tools team, the team that does the Spring IDE and Spring Tool Suite and all these nice little things for Eclipse in the past.
And my name is Kris the Volder, and I also work for the Tools team. And I'll be the one doing the demo later. So
yeah, I will hand over to Kris for the demos. So I will just do the slideware. But I promise we'll spend most of the time doing demos because I think talking about tools is boring. Showing tools in action, that's more fun. But since we're doing something new this year, it's not just an update to existing tools. We need to, I think we should introduce you to a little bit what we are doing. Before we start, there are no guarantees, right, that this will end up in a perfect final product of Pivotal, whatever you can buy and so on. But we'll have some good news in the end about that. So the mission for us as a tools team is to make basically your life easier as a Spring app developer. So when you're using Spring and you're developing enterprise apps or whatever apps for yourself, for your company, whatever, so you're spending your day-to-day life hacking on boot apps, our goal is to make your life easier, save you some time, whatever we can do to make your life while hacking boot apps easier is our goal. And if we succeed in that and make your life easier and you save some minutes a day or whatever, then we are happy and we succeed. So that's our mission. And this is our mission for quite some time already. So this stuff that you might be familiar with for Eclipse that we did in the past, which is Spring IDE and the Spring Tool Suite, it's already, when we take a look, it's already quite old, right? So it got invented in 2005, around about 2005. And at that time, everybody was using Spring with XML configuration files, with big XML files. And there was a big kind of tooling support for dealing with these XML files. Anybody still using huge XML files for Spring app development? I hope not too many of you. Otherwise, it's time to move on. When we take a look back, at that time, Eclipse was also the dominant IDE on the planet for doing Java development, right? It was the most used, heavily used IDE and the most advanced IDE for Java development. That was the case at that time. Over time, we, of course, improved Spring IDE a lot and then changed it a lot and enhanced it a lot over time. But I still think, and we thought already a few years ago, that it's maybe time to take a fresh look. Step back a little bit and rethink what we did, rethink what needs to be done for the future to help you build Spring apps. And if we take a look at this, time has changed, right? Eclipse is no longer the dominant Java IDE anymore. And some people even hate Eclipse, or they even hate not only Eclipse, but they hate these big, heavyweight IDEs in general, right? They like lightweight editors. They fire up Sublime and do coding when they do JavaScript, for example. Or they fire up simple and lightweight editors. They use multiple languages. They use multiple tools for multiple languages. So the landscape has changed quite a bit. And even existing IDEs, they might no longer run on your desktop. They might run in the cloud in the future, or maybe even lightweight tools run in the cloud in the future. On the other side, Spring has changed too. As I asked you before, no one is really doing big, heavyweight Spring XML configuration files anymore. Everybody's doing Spring Boot and configuration-driven Spring stuff. So the XML stuff is basically gone. And in addition to that, Spring apps become more and more dynamic today, right? If you use Spring Boot, there are a lot of things that are decided at runtime when you start up your boot app. What's on the class path, kind of dynamic configurations, unconditional annotations being used all over the place in libraries. So that part has changed too. So from the original idea when we started doing Spring IDE, the whole base that we thought how the world looked like that day has completely changed. That's why I think it's time to do something new for the tooling. And this is why we would like to introduce something totally new today. And this is what is Spring Tools 4. So Spring Tools 4 is something radically new in the Spring tooling landscape. It's nothing to do really with the Spring IDE or the Spring tool suite as it exists today in terms of it's just adding features or removing features. It's really something totally new. And since we still think that the tooling is so important and the landscape has so changed so much, we need to take a fresh look at what do we really need? What are the important parts? So we implemented the stuff from scratch, so we really started fresh, and we focused a lot on Spring Boot and annotation-driven development, right? That's our focus. We no longer deal with Spring XML files or whatever. The new tooling is really focused on boot and annotation-driven Spring app development. And it is super lightweight and super fast. So it never gets into your way of coding. You never have to wait for, oh, I need to wait for the build to be done. Oh, the workspace is loading. I need to wait for 5 more minutes. Oh, I cannot do anything because the user operation is waiting because something else is running in your progress bar in Eclipse or something like that. And the new tooling that we implemented from scratch is completely IDE agnostic. So it is not tied to Eclipse anymore. The key areas that we focus the new tooling on, the key things that we have in mind where we would like to help you is first, make it easy to get started. There should be a super easy experience to get started with Spring and Spring Boot, and that's what we already started in the old Spring tool suite, in the old Spring IDE, like integrating start.spring.io, having wizards to really, really easily get the guides imported and things like that. And we continue to do that, and we continue to use those bits and pieces. The other thing is, of course, we would like to help you write code. So we still provide content assist and code templates for you to hack your Spring apps. Like in this case, something that we never had before, like we had an add value annotation, and inside the brackets, you get content assist for properties, for example, property keys and things like that. But one of the, I think, most important features of the new tooling and the most awesome features of the new tooling is really super, super fast navigation for your source code and super fast navigation for your Spring elements in your code. So whenever you like to get an overview about what are my request mappings, it's just one keystroke away, right? You hit one keystroke and you see all the request mappings that you define in your code. You want to see all your functions in your code? It's one keystroke. You see all the functions in your application, in your workspace, or in your file. If you would like to see all the beans that you defined in your source code, it's one keystroke. You get a navigation to what are all my beans. You can filter all the things. We will see all that stuff in action. It's really, really awesome. The navigation is really super quick. And in addition to that, we also thought about doing validations. And validations are hard. They were easier in the old days of Spring because you could just look at the Spring XML files and see is it being defined and things like that. But since Spring apps are so dynamic today, you cannot really do a good job in validating your Spring application by just looking at the source code and doing some static analysis. It oftentimes produces warnings where there should be no warning and things like that. That's why we move away from these kind of static validations. We provide static analysis for jumping and navigating your source code and giving you an overview about what is your Spring app all about, where do I find all the bits and pieces. And in addition to that, we introduce something totally new, and we merge the source code with an additional layer that gives you additional information about your Spring application if the Spring application is running on your machine. And this is what happens for me all the time, right? I write a bit of code, and then I press run, and I run my code. I run my boot app. And whenever I run the boot app on my machine, the information that's coming from the real running boot app on my machine is going to be extracted and displayed right inside my source code. That way, I can directly see which mappings are active, which are not, how our beans are wired to which other beans, and things like that. And that is not kind of magically inferred information from code. It's really coming from a real running application. I think this is really amazing, and it really helps you a lot. We will see that in the live demo, and it's really amazing. So what we did is, it's IDE agnostic, but we still know that you like your IDE, right? So you, or some of you might still like their IDE, like IntelliJ or Eclipse or whatever. So we continue to support Eclipse. So if you want to use Eclipse, you can do that. And we give you the Spring Tools for Eclipse. You can download a distribution, or you can install that into an existing Eclipse, and that's Spring Tools for Eclipse. But that's not the only thing that we do. Since it's IDE agnostic, we also give you the Spring Tools for Visual Studio Code. So if you like VS Code, you like this lightweight editing experience with rich language tooling, you get the same stuff for VS Code. But that's not enough for us. At the starting point, we also support Spring Tools for Atom. So if you like Atom as an IDE or as an editor, you can install the Spring Tools 4 into Atom 2. There's a package on the Atom marketplace of the packages that you can just install. And all that is public beta now. So it's not the final version. So relax. You can try it out. You can download. You can play around with it. You can use it if you want to. It's a public beta, which is available on the new website, spring.io/tools4. You can just go ahead, download, and start and using it. And the most important piece of this is you can give us feedback, because we really love to hear from you what is working, what is not working for you, what are you missing, what are the bits and pieces that are interesting for you, and what do you think needs to be added to the tooling. That's what we really love to hear from you. And now I hand over to Kris for doing some, I think, really awesome demos. Okay. So let's unplug the projector quickly and do some demos.
Okay, yeah, so now it's demo time. And like Martin said, we have a couple of different platforms or editors, if you like, where we support things. So I'll start with the Eclipse environment, and the icon you see here is the new STS4 icon, which is an Eclipse distribution. We'll launch it up with some nice new artwork, and there we go. So the demo application that I'll be using is the pet clinic. And before I get started, let's just have a quick look at this application. I'll start it up here. Just this component that you see here in the bottom is the boot dashboard. That's an old component from STS3 that we still retain in STS4, because it's basically a good thing to work with your boot applications. I just started here, and you see the application is starting, and if I click here, I can go and see what it does. I'm sure you've probably seen the pet clinic before, because it's a very popular demo app, so I'm not gonna play around with it too much. The only thing I want you to see here is that on the welcome screen, I've added a message, but there is some issue with how it's being configured. So there's something wrong. And this is going to be kind of the excuse for me to use some of the editor features and figure out what the problem is. OK. I want to show you some more things, because this is an old component, the boot dashboard, but we did make a few improvements. So I want to show you a little bit of that. So if I click on this properties view here, this icon here opens a properties page. And on this, you can see some new things. So the most interesting one is this beans view here. So if you see here the beans view, it extracts live information from your running app using an actuator endpoint and displays that in a tree viewer that you can search. So for example, if I search for welcome, it will show me all the beans or things that have the word welcome in them. And you'll see that there is a thing called a welcome controller, and there is a resource properties bean, which has been injected into the welcome page handler mapping, which is another bean that you see here. So this is quite a useful view if you want to look for beans. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, because I want to show you some of the, actually more the the editor agnostic features. So let's stop this for now. And let's start looking at some of the features that Martin was talking about. So the first thing I want to show you is that we have this new navigation support. So if I'm here in Eclipse and I press Ctrl+6, it will show me a navigation menu which shows all the Spring annotations in the current file. Now, at this point, maybe that's not all that interesting because this file doesn't have much stuff in it, so there's only one annotation. But if I press Ctrl+6 again, then it shows me all the annotations in the entire workspace, and I can search for something interesting. So for example, and Martin already mentioned this, but you see here there's a little hint about what the kind of things you can search for. If you type // here, it will show you all the request mappings from your annotation. If you press +, it shows you all the beans. @> will show you functional functions. And another thing which isn't explicitly mentioned here, but which I find interesting, is you can also search by annotation type. So for example, if I want to find all the configuration classes, I can just type in here. I need to spell it I have to spell it correctly, right? So configuration, and you see there are two configuration classes in this workspace, in this application. One is the configuration for the cache, and the other is the Spring Boot application itself. There's one little detail I want to point out, is if you look here, this annotation doesn't actually have @configuration anywhere near it, but we still found it. And the reason for this is, let me press Ctrl+6 again. If you see here, inside the symbol, there is the word configuration because our search engine knows that a Spring Boot application has meta annotations, which makes this a Spring Boot configuration, which makes it a configuration, which makes it a component. So if I search for @configuration, I will actually find this, even though it's not directly annotated as such, right? It knows about this indirect inheritance relationship. Let me show you something else. So let's search for maybe some request mappings. Or actually, the next thing I want to show you is this annotation. This is for jumping around the code. So if I want to search for a controller, for example, I can add controller, and I will find some controllers that might be interesting. I can just jump around to them. You can use your cursor keys, of course, and just jump to places. Let me go to the vet controller. And the next thing I want to show you is this dynamic information. So when I start my application running, the tools will detect, it's basically watching your machine for Java processes and tries to query them for dynamic Spring Boot-related information through the actuator. So if I start my application, something starts happening here. So you see it running here. And now if we wait a little second there, you see these little green markers appearing. These are indications that there is live information available about these elements. So if I hover over this controller, then I get an injection report. So this is what you get for any kind of add component or add bean, and a controller is actually an add component indirectly. You will get this injection report which tells you where this bean is injected. In this case, not injected anywhere because controllers are just picked up by the framework from the application context. So they're not directly injected into other components. I'll show you another one that's a little bit more interesting later. If you hover over the Autowired annotation, you'll see that it tells me that this annotation tells me that there is a vet repository bean being injected in here, in this place. And in this case, it also tells you the type and where this annotation came from. Interesting, if I hover over a request mapping, it shows you that, in all of these annotations, actually, if I probably skipped over to find, you will see that it's live information coming from specific process, right? So it says here, process ID. This is the process in which I found this information, and this is what I think is interesting to you in this process. If I hover over request mapping, the same thing. It says there is a process with this ID, and there is, in this process, I found a request mapping that corresponds to this annotation. You can click on this URL, and then it opens the web page for that particular URL. So that's handy when you're testing your application.
By the way, if you have multiple instances of the same app, for example, running on your machine, like you have 3 different instances on 3 different ports, it shows the information from all 3 different apps in the hover, right? You see, oh, this is the request mapping from instance 1, this is from instance 2, this is from instance 3, so you can click on all of them if you want to.
Yeah, I could demo that, but I'm just going to go on because I want to not lose too much time. This is kind of a quick rundown of these navigation features and these hovers. But what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to try and use that to fix my problem from earlier. So if you remember what my problem was, and actually let me use this as an excuse to do something else. I said if you press Ctrl+6, you get static information, but there is actually one little exception. So there is another quick navigation that's quite handy. Is you press Ctrl+6 and then // it shows you the live request mappings in here. So these are all the request mappings in the running processes. And you can sort of scroll down and find the one you're interested in, or you can type something to search and then click on it and it opens a web page. Okay, so here's my pet clinic. So just to remind you, what I wanted to do is figure out why this message is not coming out right. So let's try and figure that out. So first step I want to do is I want to find the request mapping that's responsible for this page, right? So that is the welcome page of my application. So I'll start with the static navigation tools to get there. So I'll press Ctrl+6, and I was interested in request mapping. So there's the reminder at the top here. It says // is how I find request mapping. So I'll type // and I see my request mappings, and one of them should be the root of my application. It's this one, right? The root path. I'll click on that and jump to it. So now I see this request mapping. This is the guy that's responsible for producing that page, right? And I think if you scan the code, you'll see this here. That's obviously where this message is probably coming from. So now let's try and figure out what's happening. And what I want to kind of make clear to you here is that if you know how to read these annotations, these little markers and the information they provide, it explains perfectly what's going on here. So if you see this controller is highlighted, that actually means there is a process that contains a bean that corresponds to this. So this controller is active. That's not the problem, right? The controller is definitely being picked up by the component scan. It's active. The mapping is active, and this is the thing that's being used to serve my page. So that's all good. But what's more interesting is actually what's not highlighted in here. If you look at this annotation here, there is no little green marker there. And that's kind of a very good hint at what's wrong here. So if I compare this, for example, with the vet controller, you see that there the AutoWiring annotation is highlighted. And there is information on the hover. The fact that it's not highlighted here actually means that there is no useful auto-wiring information to display at this point, which basically means there is nothing being auto-wired at this point. And that's the problem. So this auto-wiring is not happening. This welcome message provider is not being set, which means we're just using the default guy from here, right? So that's all very consistent with the problem I'm trying to fix. So I think I understand what the problem is. At least at this point, I partially understand it. I know there is something missing. There is no bean being auto-wired. Now, the next question is, of course, why is this bean not being auto-wired? So the dynamic information is telling me there is no such bean at runtime. Now, another way I can actually verify this, and I'm just going to quickly switch back to this page here that I showed you earlier. In this beans view, which we can search, I can try to search for some kind of a bean that is called message provider something, right? Or with a type called message provider something. And see, there is no such bean. So that means there is no message provider in this application, right? So that's the problem. Now, assuming that whoever made this, which was me actually, whoever made this wanted such a bean to exist, they probably declared it somewhere, right? So let's try and use the static information to find that declaration. and see what's going on there. So I'll press Control-6 to do the static navigation and search for something called message provider. Yes, and this is always a little trap. I have to press it twice because usually I want the global information. We're probably going to fix that. The default should probably be show the global search, not the local one. So message provider. I see that there is actually such a thing in the code, not in the running application, but in the code, there is a bean declaration that makes something called a property-based welcome message provider declared by a component annotation of this type, right? So click on that, jump to it, and again, we're going to use these hovers here to figure out what might be going on. So the first thing to notice is that add component is not highlighted. And again, this is the same meaning as before. It means that in my running processes on this machine, there is nothing that corresponds to a bean from this annotation. So this thing is not working. So now, if you know a little bit about how Spring works, you might think, maybe there is something wrong with my component scan. Maybe I put this in the wrong package or something. Maybe it's not being found, and therefore this annotation is not active. But actually, that's not the case, because then this thing would not be highlighted. Because the fact that this conditional thing is highlighted means there is some information in the running application around this. And if I hover over it, it will tell me something interesting. So look at this. It says, conditional on property, did not find property pet clinic welcome message, right? So this font is a little small, I guess. Let's see if I can blow that up for you. No, I can't. Well, anyway, just, oh, sorry. Now my mouse disappeared. Not really.
Why quickly adjust to this situation? You figure out how to get the mouse cursor back.
Yeah, I might have to restart.
And I talk a little bit about the background of the tooling before we continue with the live demo. Is that okay? Maybe it's more interesting for you than watching Kris.
Yeah, let's do some slides while I fix this problem.
So I unplug this and plug it back here. Let's see. Yeah, demo time. Okay, so we come back to the demo time later in the talk. And I will do the recap of the demo once the demo is done, of course, and not before. And give you a brief overview about what's going on behind the scenes. And don't talk so loud all the time, right? Otherwise, people will listen to you, not to me. What's going on behind the scenes? So maybe it's not that interesting or it's not important for you as a Spring app developer, but maybe you're interested in how the tooling works behind the scenes, because otherwise you might be kind of surprised to see what's going on in your machine when you run the new tools. So I said that we kind of adopted a completely new tooling architecture. So it's not just we rewrote the Spring IDE stuff from scratch and did the same stuff all over again. We did it in a completely different way. And we adopted a new architecture for that to make it IDE agnostic and to make it very, very lightweight. And for that, we adopted the language server protocol that Eric Gamma talked about this morning in the keynote. I hope you were there. Then you saw that there's this idea of making the language tooling or the framework tooling completely independent of the editor, of the IDE. And that's what we're using, exactly. So when you run the tooling, in this case, for example, for Visual Studio Code, there is the editor on the one side, and there is, in a separate process, the language server running. It's running on your machine, so don't be confused about the term server. It's not running on a server machine somewhere in the cloud or whatever. It's running on your machine side by side with the editor, but it's a separate process. And those processes communicate via JSON. They send these JSON messages forward and back. And that has a lot of advantages for us, because we can really focus on the right side. So we don't have to focus on the left side. We can focus on the right side. And whenever we do something stupid and the Spring tooling crashes or hangs or freezes or whatever, you will see that the features will go away. Maybe it gets restarted under the hood, but your client-side experience is not touched, not affected in any way. You can continue coding. You can continue typing. There will never be a UI freeze just because our language server, for example, does some bad things, or another language server does some bad things, which I think is really, really, really great. The other thing is that those are completely independent processes. They can run on different platforms. So in this case, the Visual Studio Code editor, for example, that is implemented in TypeScript and runs on top of Node.js actually. And since we are Spring guys, we love to write the tools in Java, right? And that's what we can do. We don't need to re-implement them in TypeScript now and re-implement a Java parser in TypeScript because we need to parse Java code and do that kind of exercise again. We can just run the language server based on JVM, which I think is really great. It makes it really independent. And the interesting case, what Eric Emmer also said this morning is that the tooling that we built into the language server is completely independent of the client side. So whether there's Visual Studio Code that talks this protocol, or what we are seeing all the time at the moment, or what we continue to see in the moment, is Eclipse, for example, or Atom, or whatever. So that's really great. And you get this flexibility, especially for us as Spring tooling guys. We get the flexibility that we built the language server, and we don't really care what's on the other side. That's Eclipse, VS Code, Atom, and maybe 10 other IDEs in the future that are going to support the language server protocol. You more or less get the Spring tooling for free. You need to write a tiny little bit of glue code, of course, to kind of inject that there, but a very tiny little piece of glue code. Otherwise, you get Spring tooling for free. And that's what's happening for the other languages too, like the Java tooling. Java tooling for VS Code that's kind of extracted out of Eclipse, runs as a language server. You get that for Atom, you get that for VS Code, and more or less for all the other guys implementing the language server protocol, and vice versa. So you have Eclipse, and Eclipse supports the language server protocol, and suddenly you can use all the language servers that are available and use them in Eclipse. So if there's a great language server for C#, you can use that in Eclipse, which is great. Right? And you don't, and especially for these C# and C++ guys, because they are really sick of re-implementing C++ parsers in Java. Right? Now they can finally reuse the Clang code or whatever. That is what's really great. And before I go to the outlook, I think the mouse cursor is back, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, the mouse cursor is back.
I can see it. So we move back to the demo.
Yeah.
So sorry for these kind of rearrangement of the slides and of the flow. But
yeah. So let's
hope we can get the flow back into the demo.
Yep, there we are. Okay, so let's pretend nothing bad happened, and we're still here at the same point where I got lost with my mouse cursor. The hover here shows that basically this property does not exist, and therefore this component is not, this condition is not matched, right? So that's why this component does not exist. I think this is the point where we know what to do about our problem, and I could go and fix it. But now, like Martin just said, we actually have the same editor support in Atom and VS Code. So let's, just for the sake of a demo, I'm not going to use Eclipse anymore. So I'm going to switch from Eclipse to another editor now. I'm going to go to Atom, switch to Atom. I need to go to the right directory again. Right, okay. So we're gonna go Atom here, open Atom on this editor, the Atom editor, and close these welcome pages. And just want to quickly show you, we see the same kind of little icons and hovers. The styling is a little bit different, but it's basically the same information being displayed in a different color font, basically, just the same. And the same kind of annotations are available there. Another thing I want to show you, this is not really a new feature, but it's a new feature in the sense that we never had this editor in Atom before. We had this editor in Eclipse. Now this editor also works in Atom. So we have a nice editor that provides you with hover information and validations around your keywords. Sorry, Well, if you look at, let's change something here, make a typo, you see that there is hover saying that this is kind of an unknown property, right? So we have content assist and things like that. And I already kind of prepared my demo because I'm a cheater, right? So I have something here to uncomment and fix the problem. But I'm not actually going to fix it because I want to show you the other editor too. So let's now switch from Atom to VS Code. So I'm going to close Atom. And another thing I want to show you is, and this is not, I have to say, this is not something we built. We just kind of benefit from the fact that other people are also playing in this space, and we get some nice synergy. So there is nice tooling for Java in VS Code. So I'm just going to show you something very cool. I'm going to stop the application here, the Pet Clinic. I'm going to go to VS Code and do some debugging inside VS Code. So let's go here. All right, so let's close some things I didn't really want to show you yet. Actually, the welcome properties was probably good. So what I want to do is, and first thing, we have the same navigation tools. So if I press Ctrl-T, the keyboard combination is a little different. And then I press @ to go to the request mappings, or I can press + to find beans, the same kind of search shortcuts. So jump to my welcome controller, or I can jump to my main application. So I just search for Spring Boot application and go here. And now let's run this application from VS Code. So all I have to do is press F5, or I can go here and, where is the debug menu? Here. Start debugging. So that's, as you can see, there's a keyboard shortcut for that, F5. And it asks me if I want to use Node.js or Java, because there is some JavaScript code in this project for the web pages. So it doesn't really know that it's pure Java project. So I'll just pick Java. And what it does here generates a little launch configuration. I can change some things here. So for example, I put some arguments, and these arguments, you could use them to set profiles or JVM heap memories or things like that, right? So things you might want to do, but I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to run it. So I'll leave this launch configuration. I'll just press F5 again, and it's launching my application here. So you see it's starting. This is the output from the Spring Boot application, and I can switch to, let's go to my request mapping again, the one I wanted to see. So /, and let's put a breakpoint in here because we have a debugger. Okay, so I put a breakpoint. You already see some of the view here showing stuff like breakpoints and variables, and if I use my Spring Boot navigation support and hover over this, or hover over this, you can see the link, the live link to my endpoint. I'll click on it, opens a web page, and boom, we are hitting the breakpoint. So the debugger works, basically. You can browse your variables. You can see what's going on. You can step in and out of things. So let's, for example, if I step in here, you can see that it jumps to the default welcome message provider, which is all still consistent with what we thought the problem was, right? So I see the debugger is working and telling me what I expect to see. I'm just going to run the debugger now. I'm just going to let it run because I already know what the problem is, so I don't really need to debug it any further. So let's press play. I'll remove the breakpoint again. There you go. And now let's fix our problem, right? So one more thing I want to show you before, what I want to point out, which I didn't tell you, is this application has Spring Boot DevTools as a dependency on it. So this is something that you've also seen mentioned in the keynote. Phil Webb mentioned that. So what happens is if I make any change to my application, the DevTools will kick in and basically automatically restart this application in a few seconds. And that's very handy, as you will see. So for example, let's, just to make a little point here, let's go and put that properties welcome message provider on the screen. I'll put it on the side so we can see our annotations. And I'm going to uncomment this little line of code which defines the missing property. There's a little warning that shows up here. I don't want you to pay too much attention to that yet. There is a problem there, but it's not a problem with my application. It's more a problem with the metadata that tells the editor this thing exists. I'm going to show you later how to fix this, but let's just ignore this for now. Okay, so I'm uncommenting this, saving it, and watch the window here. It takes a few seconds before DevTools realizes there's a change, but we should see. Oh, actually, I think it already happened. Because it was not scrolling, you couldn't see it. But you saw that there is some activity, and you will see that something's changing here with these annotations. So see that this thing became active. So that means my component is now no longer being, it's actually being activated, right? So this is highlighted. There is a bean like that now in the running application. If I hover over this, the information inside has changed. It doesn't say anymore that this property does not exist. It now says this condition is matched, which means it applies here. So this bean exists now. And I think that kind of fixes our problem. The only thing that really left for me to do is to verify that. So again, I can use my quick navigation to go to @//. Oh, or does that not work in here? Yeah, that does work. So jump to it and confirm, indeed, a proper message appears, okay? So this is kind of as far as I want to go with the VS Code demos, and now let's return back to Eclipse. We're going to return back to our good old Eclipse environment. And I'll tell you, for now, if you want the most polished experience, you should probably still use Eclipse, because Eclipse has a few extra things that you wouldn't get in Atom and VS Code yet. For example, the boot dashboard and some other things that you won't get. And so it has a few more features, and it has basically gives you the most polished experience at this point. But VS Code is getting very good, and Atom is slowly getting there as well. So those things are only going to get better. Yeah. Oh, I forgot to stop it here, right? I need to stop this process. There. I can close this now. And we can restart the pet clinic from here. And the last thing I promised to do something, so I haven't forgotten. If I go to my application properties file here, see the warning message that shows up, and you see again, switch between the different editors, you get a very similar experience, you get the same messages. They're rendered a little bit differently and the colors aren't the same, but the messages are kind of the same. So why is this not showing up? Well, this is because I defined this property-based welcome message provider in a slightly funny way. No, sorry, not the property. So this anachronistic way of defining or accessing properties doesn't give the IDE a very good hint at which properties you're actually using. So in theory, any property always exists, right? It just matters what somebody wants to read. So basically, you say the property exists, basically just means somebody's interested in that and reading that information, right? So the IDE can't really figure this kind of thing out. But Spring Boot provides a mechanism now for you to define properties the right way, which gives you a nice editor experience. And I'll do that now. So let's go and do, how much time do we have left?
It's okay.
Yeah?
Yep.
Well, actually, maybe I should show something else. The profiles annotation. What do you think is nicer?
Yeah, profiles.
Yeah, because we're running out of time. I think this is probably something you've seen in another demo. So I'll show you something that's only available in our environment. So if I go to my application properties file again, you see here we have Spring profiles active, and I have another way to activate this configuration. So a slightly different way of configuring these. So let's get rid of this configuration thing for now. The bean will disappear again. So you see this component is going to go away in a second. And if I look around my code you see that I also have something called a randomized message provider, which is a slightly different way of configuring things. Now, if I uncomment this code, which I prepared, you see that that one is activated in a different way. Again, you see that this component is not active, and there is a profile annotation here. So when I hover over this profile annotation, you see that there is some information about which profiles are active in the running processes. So it says, I found this process, which looks like a Spring Boot process, and in that process, there is a profile active that's called production. And if you look at this here, it says there is a profile called experimental or S1P that would activate this component. But since production is neither of these two, that's not active. If I change that here, profiles active, let's just add one and say S1P and do like this. Save it, and you see the DevTools kicking in, and this thing is changing. And component became active, and this profile became active. So there is a very easy way to see why this annotation is active now. The little box around S1P tells you basically this profile is active. Okay? I think this is probably, do you still need a few minutes to close off? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, so that's kind of where I want to close off the demo then, and I'll give Martin back to do some more slides.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the demo. So let's switch back to some details. Let's see. That looks good. So what do we see? We've seen the boot dashboard. That's kind of one of the existing components to make it easy to kind of start and stop and dealing with multiple boot projects in your workspace. And I think that's one of the most useful features in the existing Spring tool suite. And we, of course, carry that over to the new one, to the new tooling. We've seen the ultra-fast navigation, like at your fingertips, press add / you get all the request mappings and so on. I think that's really one of the, especially these kind of getting that with a single keystroke and with a tiny little snippet, you can really easily jump across all your source code and find all the bits and pieces of your Spring app. And we saw the information from live running apps and how you can use them to learn and to see what's going on in your running boot app and get that information directly in your source code, which I think is really, really, really powerful. We also saw different IDEs, so Atom, VS Code, and Eclipse. And there are some things that we haven't shown in the demo, like additional navigation for functions. So if you do these kind of Spring Cloud functions or function-based programming with Spring, we are working on, and there is already a version that you can see all the functions that you have defined in your boot app. Live informations for add value annotations. So if you have this add value thing, and you put the old-fashioned way of putting the value in there, you can hover over that, and you can see the value that's actually coming from the live app for this annotation. Some code completions. We haven't shown them. Some other code templates. And we are, of course, working on more. It's just the first public beta that is now available. And we continuously think about new ways and additional ways to provide you better shortcuts to navigate your code. For example, we think about the webflux support that you might have seen in the keynote this morning, which is not just based on add request mapping and then you define the path. It's slightly different, right? This reactive web framework works slightly different, but it would be great to have the same quick navigation across your source code with the symbol infrastructure that we have in place. So we're working on that. Same for giving you access to your data repositories, right? You define multiple Spring data repositories, and usually maybe you don't really put an annotation on them because you just implement an interface like a JPA repository interface. You don't need to add an annotation, a Spring-specific annotation to that. But wouldn't it be nice if you could just have a shortcut to list you all the Spring data repositories with all the specific data in there, like for what kind of domain type is this repository defined. And of course, there might be more editors coming up that support the language server protocol that we can maybe support in the future with that stuff.
So you'll be able to use Emacs.
Yeah, there's...
No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, no. You said you're kidding, but actually, it's already appearing on the list of editors that are working on support for the language server protocol. So if you're really eager to use Emacs,
or VI,
you can do that, right? Okay. So we already talked about the behind-the-scenes thing, so we'll jump over there to the outlook. And the outlook is that what's the timeline, basically, right? Yesterday, we announced the Spring Tools for public beta, so that's available now on the new website. And there is still the existing Spring Tool Suite 3.9.1 release out there. That's kind of still the main IDE that we ship. And that will continue for some time. So the public beta period will continue for round about half a year until mid of next year. That's roughly scheduled around the next big Eclipse release in the mid of next year, the Eclipse Photon release. So within that period, we will continuously ship updates to the existing Spring 3.9x stream, update that to new Eclipse versions, fix bugs, improve it slightly, and we will, at the same time, continuously update the public beta for the Spring Tools 4. So you will be able to get new updates from that stream, new features, if you want to see what's going on in that time period, in the next half year, basically, in the next 7 months, roundabout. In July next year, around about the mid of next year, there will be the shift over to the new tooling, right? So in the mid of next year, the new Spring Tools 4 will become the main component that we ship as the IDE in all the different flavors. Like you get the Eclipse distribution with the new Spring Tools 4 inside, based on the latest Eclipse release. You get the stuff for VS Code, you get the stuff for Atom. You can use that. At the same time, we don't really, let's say, throw away the old tooling. So if you're still in love with the old tooling and you still need the old tooling because you found some old-fashioned Spring XML project somewhere in your repositories, or you need it for some different reason, you will be able to install the old tooling into an existing Eclipse installation, so they will still be around, like you can do at the moment from the Eclipse Marketplace, right? You can just install them into an existing Eclipse, and you will be able to install them into an then existing Spring Tool Suite 4 distribution that we ship. So you could enhance your Spring Tools 4 distribution with the old tooling. That's possible, and that allows you to kind of slowly migrate over if you're still really heavily in love with the old tooling, or we haven't implemented something that's really important for you and really important for your project, which could be, right? So what's the path for moving over from the old tooling to the new tooling? So the new tooling will still be a full-featured Eclipse distribution. You can use that kind of flavor built on the latest Eclipse releases. And you can install the old components as add-ons, so you have both. That's one way. And the other thing is that I would like to mention is that we will continue to fix problems in the old tooling for a little bit more time. So they will be available as add-on components. There will be no kind of Eclipse distribution anymore that you can download, but they will be available as add-on components. We will continue to fix problems and updates for the let's say, SCS 3.9x components with an update site, and it will be compatible with the next Eclipse release, of course. So if you still would like to use that, you can do that. So that's kind of the outlook. And we totally forgot to say at the beginning that you can ask questions anytime in between, which is really brilliant to mention that in the end. Yeah.
But you can ask questions now if you want.
But the good thing is we still have plenty of time to answer questions now. So sorry for forgetting that at the beginning, but we are really, really happy to hear from you and to answer questions.
Do we have a mic for the audience? Or?
How many people are working on the different flavors? So, for example, Atom versus Visual Code, and Eclipse.
Yeah, the question, we need to repeat the question, I think, maybe at least for the recording or whatever. So the question is, how many people from our side are working on the different flavors? Yeah. And the answer is it's all the same people. So it's one small team that's working on everything. But we really focus our efforts on building, and that's the real advantage here, on building the language server itself. This is the big piece that we are working on. The integrations for Atom, VS Code, and Eclipse, that's built by someone else, basically, because there's a team from, I think, not a team from Red Hat, but some people from Red Hat, some people from other companies, and occasionally someone from us working on an Eclipse project.
And not to forget the Microsoft guys, right?
To integrate.
To do the VS Code. They brought VS Code, and they were the ones who drove the language server protocol. So.
Yeah, and
but we're getting a lot of help in a way, we're leveraging a lot of other people's work because of this language server protocol.
Yeah. The people that working on the Eclipse project, so the LSP integration for Eclipse is a project at Eclipse, multiple people working on that, and sometimes we contribute patches and work on that too. There are the VS Code integration for LSP that's done by Microsoft and the VS Code guys, and there are people from GitHub working on the Atom LSP integration, so we don't need to do that ourselves. We need to write this tiny little piece of glue code, but that's basically it, right? That's why we don't need to implement the LSP support itself for all the clients. That's a gift for us.
Thank you.
And that's a big advantage.
Follow-up is on that Spring boot. What is it? It's in Eclipse. Spring dashboard. Is that available in anything other than Eclipse, or is that kind of still native to the SES 3.9 right now?
Yeah, the question is whether the boot dashboard, this kind of you start up and stop your apps, if that is still specific to Eclipse, or will that be available for other editors and IDEs at the moment? The component is specifically built for Eclipse. So it was built for Eclipse, it's still built for Eclipse. There's, of course, the idea of building that for VS Code on Atom 2 in some kind of similar flavor, but I'm not sure how that will work out, because we will really try to focus on the language server side to do the work once and not go in too much into the game of building specific UIs for all the clients for additional features too much, because then we end up kind of tripling our work, right? We don't have to build the boot dashboard for Eclipse. Now we have to build the boot dashboard for Eclipse and VS Code and Atom and maybe 10 others. So that would be complicated. But
it's something that we're probably going to have to put some thought into, but I guess at this point, we don't know how or if it will be done.
We cannot promise anything, but the boot dashboard is, of course, one of the most famous and useful features in that. So it sounds really useful to have the same stuff in VS Code or Atom too. Yeah, and we know that. Okay, next question. Yeah.
You say you discovered Java processes running on the same machine. Is there anything you have to do for your Spring Boot apps to be discovered? How does it get all the beans from the app? And how does it know what port it's running on that?
Yeah, the question is how do we do the magic of, we find there's a boot app running in your machine. Now we display all the information. We don't tell you how we do that. That's a question, right?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is it works the same way as your commands like JPS. So there is some magic that you can do to discover a running Java process. And then we can access the actuator endpoints through JMX.
So you need to have the actuators.
So there's very little, there's no magic you have to do. It works, yeah.
But the actuators have to be on the project. If you don't have the actuators, there will be hovers showing up in the IDE, and they will tell you, hey, you don't have, we have found a process, but there's no actuator. Maybe you should add the actuator to display this awesome information. And the communication with the actuators under the hood is done with JMX. Right? You find the Java process on the machine, you access them with JMX, and you find out what's a boot app and where is the actuator endpoint, and then you get that. Yeah. So it's not real magic. When you try this and you find out that this is kind of causing trouble on your machine, right? Maybe it's, I don't know, causing polling the stuff too frequently or consuming too much CPU or whatever, there's a flag, there's an option to turn this off. So you can turn this kind of inspecting your machine for running boot apps all the time and displaying the information. You can turn this off if this kind of is too annoying for you, or does crazy stuff, or goes wild. I don't know. You can turn that off. More questions? Yeah.
So you mentioned, or you showed how you can search for the different annotations. Is that search being performed on everything in the class path, or is it just limited to the files of the project?
The question is whether the search, the static analysis that we do to provide you the quick navigation for all the Spring annotations, whether it's kind of limited to the class path or the source files or whatever. At the moment, it's limited to the source files, to the source that's in your project or in your workspace.
Yeah.
It's not scanning jar files and libraries on your class path, not yet. That's not in the public beta yet, but this is one of the important things that we will add during the next weeks and months.
Yeah, I also think we should think about whether that's a good or a bad thing, because I'm not convinced that you would want that always. Like, maybe you want it sometimes, maybe you want it always, but I think before we jump into that, we should actually play with it a bit and see if it doesn't overwhelm with things you don't really want to see, because ultimately, I think you're more interested in your own source code, and sometimes it might be interesting what's coming from the framework, right?
Well, in our situation, we will create a lot of common aspects to our application and wrap them in jars that the team can pull in. So
Yeah.
it would be nice if the team could search for things that maybe were in our package domain for our company.
Yeah.
That way, and be able to pull everything from the source code as well as the library that they would pull.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion, to kind of try to limit the scope of the search, broaden it beyond source files, but not broaden it to everything. Because I'm also a little bit concerned how to really display the information when you go this quick navigation and you see quick navigation request mapping and you see, I don't know, 500, but you're really just interested in 20, and you have to scroll or kind of search and type to get the right things, because we really try to provide you the right information right up front and not overwhelm you with everything. But the suggestion with the kind of limiting the scope, that could be really interesting. Yeah, good idea. Cool.
Any other
More questions?
Was there another question?
Okay. Thanks for coming. Hope you enjoyed the session, and don't forget to rate on your mobile phone, right? Rate the session, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks for coming.